My name is Emily Carter, and I was 35 when I watched everything I had built get handed to someone else in one smooth meeting. I remember the light in the conference room, the way it hit the glass wall and turned the city beyond into a smear of steel and gold. I remember how my presentation lived on my laptop in the far corner of my inbox, and how I had stayed up 3 nights to shape the roadmap, the numbers, the user journeys, and the risk assessments until every piece fit like a gear in a clock. I remember walking into that room with my heart a tight fist, and the slide deck open on the screen, and then watching Claire stand up, click through my slides, and tell the story I had written as if she had invented it that morning. She smiled, she laughed at the right places, she made eye contact with people who mattered, and by the time she finished, the CEO was nodding and the VP was already asking how fast we could scale. I sat very still and felt my throat close around all the words I had rehearsed. I said nothing. I breathed in the air that smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaning spray, and a new carpet that blamed me for thinking the world was fair. It was the hardest silence I had ever held. I left the room, and the promotion was announced by the end of the week. Claire took my project and my title in one tidy sweep, and everyone else clapped because she did not make them uncomfortable. I left the office that night, and the city lights were cold through the rain. I told no one that I had been awake for 70 hours building the plan that would have been my crowning work. I told no one that for 10 years I had centered my life around work, so it would mean something. I told no one that my name was Emily Carter, and I had spent my 30s making a careful map of how to be useful and how to leave a mark. When the promotion announcement hit the team chat, my phone buzzed until the battery died. I sat on the curb outside the building and counted the exact beat of my pulse until I could name it. Betrayal is a small animal that can swallow a whole house, I thought. I wanted to scream, but I walked home instead and made dinner I did not taste. That night I replayed the meeting like a film. With the sound turned down and the subtitles wrong, I thought back to small things that suddenly mattered, like when Claire had asked to borrow my notes 3 months before and left with a smile that felt practiced. I thought about the one time she had dropped by my desk with a problem, and how I had stayed late to help her debug the prototype, and she had thanked me with a look that meant I owed her. I thought about how, in a company that claimed to value originality, a good voice and a confident smile could erase a year of grinding work. I did not go to HR. I did not call a lawyer. I did not march into the CEO's office and demand my due. I held my hand over my mouth because whenever I opened it, my voice sounded small. I was 35 and I was ashamed, not because I had failed, but because I had let someone else take the credit I had bled for. That shame made me quiet, and quiet made me dangerous. I was raised in a town where people kept their promises to each other because promises were currency, and you did not spend it quickly. My father sold used cars, and my mother taught at the elementary school, and they taught me that modesty did not mean weakness, and that you could beat the world with patience and good accounting. I carried those lessons into my career in product and operations, and when I had my first big win, I kept my head down while the praise swelled around me. I loved making things that worked. I loved the servo of a plan falling into place. I had been the kind of worker bosses trusted with the messy, invisible things. I wanted equity and to be seen, and for people to stop underestimating me. Claire was the opposite in every small way that mattered. She was charming and aggressive, and she had a way of taking center without apologizing. She came from a pedigree that made older men listen and young men defer. She read social currency like a language and spent it like cash. I resented her then with a mild professional jealousy. The theft of my work turned that mild resentment into something crystalline. I did not want to just get my job back. I wanted to dismantle the architecture that allowed her to slide in and take it. I wanted to win in a way that the company could not ignore. So I started by watching and listening. Quiet was my ally. I stayed at my desk later and later and watched the lights go out on my floor until I knew the flick of every switch. I learned which people drank from the same coffee machine and who used the same elevator and which managers liked their reports, colored with glossy graphs instead of raw numbers. I read the way Claire moved through the office, who she smiled at, who she avoided. She was not careful with details because she did not need to be. She trusted charm to cover gaps. That arrogance would be her undoing. I made no threats. I made a ledger. I wrote down every meeting where I had presented drafts and every email where I had sent the deck. I pulled timestamps from my files. I collected the messages that showed how the idea matured in my hands. I printed them and put them in a folder I kept at home beneath the bed. I started documenting the flow of budget requests and the approvals and how Claire had rebranded my technical terms into language the sales team liked. I archived the commit history on the prototype and the plain text notes in an old version control system where my edits were visible line by line. I spent nights converting work into evidence without telling anyone. While I collected proof, I also built a parallel world inside the company. I became small for weeks on purpose. I answered emails promptly. I fixed bugs in record time. I stayed out of meetings I did not need to be in. And I cultivated a reputation for being reliable and unflashy. People started to trust me in a new way. My manager noticed my steady output and sent a thank you note. A junior teammate began to ask me for quick mentorship, and I said yes because loyalty binds faster than success sometimes. I watched Claire start to falter in small ways. She grew careless because she could. She began to miss details. She relied on her team to fill the gaps, and when those people were busy, she made decisions without looking at the numbers I had left in my drafts. There was a client who liked the idea best when it came wrapped in metrics, and the first rollout under Claire missed those thresholds. The client was not furious. The client was disappointed, and disappointment levered itself into conversations that began to include the words maybe and next quarter. That slippage gave me room. I did not act revengefully at first. I acted like a surgeon of patience. I brought notes to meetings that were gentle but precise. I corrected numbers without doing it like a rebuke. I offered to take ownership of a small pilot that Claire had left half-finished. People let me because I was not brash. I built a team that liked me because I rewarded them for small wins, and I did not take credit publicly. I let them take the applause. That built loyalty. I learned that the slow burn was more potent than a confrontation. I began to leak competence into the ecosystem like a slow infusion. I also watched Claire outside the office. I learned where she ate lunch and who she texted on Sundays. I watched how she behaved when she thought nobody was looking and saw the cracks she tried not to show. She loved the parts of success that looked like a parade. She collected accolades like trophies, and she did not guard her ego carefully. The more I watched, the weaker her center looked. I decided to make a series of precise moves that would move the chessboard in my favor without crying wolf or fabricating evidence. Step 1 was to secure allies higher up. I had lunch with the VP of sales, a pragmatic woman named Marta, who liked numbers and straightforward people. Over coffee, I asked questions about the metrics the company had promised the client, and about risk mitigation, and about what measured success would look like in 30 and 60 days. Marta, who liked being helpful, asked me to draft a one-page plan for recovery, and sent it to the CEO with a line that said, Emily had the institutional memory the team needed. When I sent that plan, it included clear timelines and the original metrics, and a note about how the initial prototype had been shaped. I showed restraint in my tone, but the content was mine, and it had the fingerprints of the late nights. The CEO was a man who rewarded calm and competence. He read my page, and he called me into his office to ask how quickly I could get the pilot back on track. I told him 2 weeks, and he looked at me like he had just discovered a compass that pointed toward profit. That call shifted things. Claire was now seen as less certain. She defended her work with impromptu meetings that looked frantic. Her team started to fracture because pressure exposes who is there for applause and who is there for the work. Step 2 was to make Claire visibly fall. I needed mistakes that could not be explained away by personality. I needed a thread that connected her charisma to outcomes that were bad for business. I found that thread in the rollout plan. One small update in the codebase had not been tested across all customer environments, and Claire had glossed over that detail. I brought that to light with clinical precision. I did not call attention to it in a meeting. I wrote a careful email to the development lead and the operations manager outlining the gap and the potential customer impact. My language was factual and spare. The operations manager forwarded the email to the VP, and we all watched the client pivot their launch timeline. The client asked for explanations and metrics, and the company could not deliver a confident one. In 1 week, the market narrative shifted from innovation to caution. Claire's name appeared in internal threads, not as a heroine, but as the origin point of the misstep. People began to ask if she was ready to run a project at scale. I still did not make demands. I kept my face neutral. The sense of being wronged had changed in me into something colder. I wanted not only to flip the outcome, but to dismantle the emotional scaffolding that allowed her to walk away untouched. I was no longer thinking about justice in the way I had when I was younger. I was thinking about making a clean cut that left no loose ends. While the team repaired the misstep, I worked on a plan that would land me in the position I wanted. I knew the promotion route would be official. I also knew that the company was small enough that reputation and timing played a big role. I wrote a resurrection plan for the pilot that was furious in its simplicity. It had a deployment timeline broken into hourly tasks, a customer communication plan, contingency steps, and measurable outcomes that could be reported during the next executive meeting. I rehearsed the presentation alone in my apartment, speaking to empty chairs like scenes from a play. I practiced answering the questions I imagined Claire would be asked. I practiced the calmness and the clarity I needed to sound inevitable. When the week ended, the pilot was stabilized and the client agreed to move forward on a probationary basis. The CEO asked that whoever had written the recovery plan present it to the board. I stood up and walked into the boardroom with the slide deck I had refined in the middle of the night. I told the story in a steady voice and showed the numbers and paused in places where the space in the room allowed people to imagine success. I spoke, and the room leaned in. When I finished, the CEO said, "We need someone who will own this. Emily, are you willing to step in?" Claire sat across from me with a look I could not immediately name, and then she smiled as if nothing could touch her. That smile had cost her. I said yes. The board voted and the title was offered to me. I was given the keys to the project and a modest raise, and the team looked relieved. I allowed myself a small pleasure when my manager patted my shoulder and used the word well-deserved. I felt the old ache ease, but the world had not yet balanced. Claire was still there, her ego scraped, but not yet broken. I had to decide how far I would go. I had planned this to be surgical. I had not planned to make someone bleed. The moral question hovered like a heat haze. Would taking her job be enough, or did I want something more absolute? And watching Claire on the phone after the meeting changed me. She sounded small and furious, and I felt the first dangerous thrill of power. I had the right to be vindicated, and the thrill of vindication is sweet in a way that is almost chemical. I repressed it because I knew the difference between winning a fair fight and burying a person under a weight of public failure. Yet I was not content with the fairness of taking back the work and moving on. I wanted others to see that charm without substance could not buy a future. I wanted to pull the thread until the whole garment unraveled, so that the next time someone tried the same trick, the company would be wiser. That led me to step 3, which had consequences I had not fully reckoned with at first. I began to look for structural weaknesses in the way the company rewarded visibility. I found them threaded through the performance review process and the bonus allocation system. I then began to gather testimony from people Claire had used as props. I listened to junior staffers who had been promised recognition and got none, and to vendors who had been promised deliverables that were never landed. I listened without judgment and took notes. A former contractor confessed that Claire had promised them a recommendation in exchange for unpaid work and then disappeared. A product manager told me that Claire inflated the initial projections without consulting the data team and claimed credit later. I collected small grievances and turned them into a pattern that suggested a cultural problem. I did not invent anything. I wrote it down and organized it and made it legible to people who liked systems. Then I brought it to the head of HR in a meeting that I framed as a plea for stronger governance and better documentation. HR had been stretched thin, and they were eager to strengthen the audit process. An audit meant an examination of the path the project had taken from sketch to launch. That audit pulled emails and calendars and code commits. And because I had kept my own records, it was embarrassingly easy to show how the idea had evolved under my hand. The audit did not point a finger at first, but it did highlight discrepancies between who approved what and when. This is where being methodical pays off. Claire's name kept surfacing in places where responsibility had been assumed but not recorded. The audit also revealed several ethical lapses around vendor agreements and the perception of quid pro quo that made the HR department salivate because it meant policy violations. Once the company had a reason to dig, they could not stop. I watched from the sidelines as HR interviewed people and as the operations team combed through logs. Claire showed up to some interviews unprepared and defensive. She styled herself as competent and overwhelmed, and the combination made her answers less believable. The more she tried to explain away the things she had done, the worse she sounded. I felt a new sensation then, a cold satisfaction that was not the same as triumph. It was the sensation of a plan resolving into shape. There was, of course, a cost to this. I had to live with the fact that my actions would affect another human being deeply. I could say I was justified because she had stolen from me. I could say it was corporate necessity. But at night, I sometimes replayed the email threads and imagined Claire at her kitchen table, trembling as her world tilted. It did not stop me. I knew I was capable of harm, and I went ahead anyway because the harm served a larger purpose in my mind. The consequences of what we do for the sake of being seen are not always clean. HR eventually recommended disciplinary action for ethical violations and a formal reprimand for mishandling vendor relations. The company paused Claire's promotion and put her on a performance improvement plan, which, in the culture of that office, was a thinly veiled step toward exile. She was given less responsibility and placed under supervision. Her friendships at the office frayed because people like to be connected to winners. And she was not one anymore. I had taken her project and her title. I had also stripped the social scaffolding that made her immune. The day she cleared out her desk, the office looked like a set where someone had forgotten to leave the props. I felt something numb and less than victorious. I had aimed a blow that left scars. Claire sent me one message as she walked out, and it was a palette of words that tried to pin me as a backstabber and a traitor. I read it with a cup of coffee in my hands and felt the heat no longer. I did not reply. The final phase of my plan was to consolidate the position so that no one could hand it back to her like a toy. I knew that promotions are fragile if not backed by tangible outcomes, so I worked like a maniac. I coordinated the rollout, I negotiated contracts, I delivered the first wave of metrics ahead of schedule, and I made sure the sales team had something real to sell. I held weekly town halls with the client and I made them feel secure. People began to trust me in a way that was different from the deference given to charm. I could see it in the meetings, in the way people started to ask for my opinion before a decision, and in the way the CEO used me as proof that the company had resilience. I also took care of myself in the small ways I had neglected when I was younger. I slept, I cooked, I reconnected with my sister, and I bought a coat that fit. Strength, I learned, is both the accumulation of good habits and the ability to keep promises to yourself. Months passed and the pilot became a full product line. The metrics I had promised arrived, and in their wake, a budget increase and a new team. I grew into my role the way a plant finds the light, which is to say slowly and with work. I watched Claire on LinkedIn from time to time and saw that she had started another job. She posted a picture with a new team and a caption about fresh starts. I scrolled past without comment and felt neither triumph nor pity. I had what I wanted. I had the title and the project and the people who believed in me. But at times I felt a phantom ache where the line between right and wrong had blurred. People asked me if I was happy, and I told them yes, because the truth is complicated. I was content in the practical sense. I walked the office like a woman who had rebuilt a house after someone else set the windows on fire. But scars show. Old wounds do not always close neatly. On some nights, I woke with a taste of metal in my mouth and wondered if I had become the kind of woman I had once warned myself against. I had taught myself to value work as a language of survival, and it had worked. I also saw how easy it was to weaponize the system, and how the desire to correct an injustice can lead to new ones. There were personal costs, too. The junior teammate who had once admired me started to keep a distance because they had seen the way I had gathered complaint and turned it into policy. A vendor refused to take my calls after the audit because they had been dragged through an uncomfortable process. The victory had collateral. I had to live with that. Still, there is a satisfaction that is not petty when you fix a system and not merely topple a person. I instituted clearer credit practices, mandatory documentation, and a more transparent approval chain so that the company would not be able to reward flash over substance again. I made it harder for someone to stand in the glow and claim authorship of work that was not theirs. That was the final practical part of my plan, and it felt, at least at first, like a balm. The last scene happened nearly a year after the meeting where Claire had stolen my project. We had the office party for the new product launch. The room hummed with people and the music was an easy background pulse. The CEO made a speech and he mentioned the team and the persistence of the people who had stayed. People laughed and drank champagne. I stood near the windows and looked out at the city that had raised and flattened me in the space of a few seasons. Claire was not there. I heard later that she was at another event, another company's launch, looking for a place to set herself again. I raised my glass to the room, and the small swell of applause felt like a ledger settling. As I left the party, some of the people I had worked with came up and thanked me in a way that meant something. The junior teammate who had once sought my mentorship hugged me and said, "You saved this." That line was literal, and it stung. I had saved a product, but I had also saved my own sense of agency, and that had required cruelty. Cruelty is a tool like any other. It can be used carefully, or it can be used to destroy. I had used it carefully. The payoff I had set for myself was not simply a promotion or a raise. It was the knowledge that a person who takes by charm only does so because systems allow them to. I wanted to change the system, even if that meant burning bridges. There was a last act that people did not see. I went to an empty conference room at dusk and sat with a folder of all the documents I had collected. I read every email and every note, and I felt all the old feelings wash over me like a tide. There was anger and grief and a hard, bright satisfaction. I made a decision then to write a short note and leave it in Claire's outbox. She would see it if she ever logged in again. In the note, I wrote very simply, "You took what was not yours, and you left the mess for others. I took your position back, and I learned how to keep what I build. I hope you learn honesty. I hope you remember that charm is temporary." I did not say anything cruel beyond the truth. I hit send, and then I deleted the note because leaving it felt like a staging. Instead, I left a printed copy on her chair the next morning after she had resigned. The paper was folded neat. It had no flourish, it had only words. She left a single sticky note on the corner the next day that said, "You won." I taped that note to the inside of my office drawer, where I keep small things that remind me of the work I have done. People like a tidy conclusion. They like the narrative where the betrayed becomes the victor and then bows and moves on. That is not how life always goes. There were nights when I woke thinking I had done too much, and mornings when the sunlight on my desk felt like forgiveness enough. I learned that taking a position is more than stepping into a chair. It is making a place that will not allow theft to happen again. It is building structures so that credit is clear and labor is visible. It is making a workspace that will not let charm substitute for competence. I am not proud of the parts of me that enjoyed Claire's downfall. I am not proud of how quickly I learned to make the system work for me, in a way that cut off others. I am proud that I could hold a project to light and find where it was weak and repair it. I am proud that I learned to speak in the language of bosses and not only the language of makers. In the end, the payoff was harsher than I had first imagined. I did not simply take her position and walk away smiling. I took it, and I made sure that there was no easy way back for someone who would use a smile to claim my labor. I changed the rules, and in changing them, I also changed the office and a few lives. That is the nature of power. It reshapes the people around it, and the person who wields it changes too. Sometimes that change is for the good, and sometimes it is for less noble reasons. The last line of the story that I told myself at night, when the city was quiet, was simple and brutal. I had lost something precious once, and I had learned to take it back by any means necessary. It had made me sharper and colder, and it had given me the one thing I had wanted more than validation or money, which was control. Control is a heavy thing. It keeps you steady in storms, and it pulls weight. It also isolates because people fear the hands that can move mountains. I lived with that isolation because the cost of doing nothing felt worse. I had been betrayed, and I had answered. I had paid with quiet cruelty and careful patience, and with a willingness to hurt someone who had hurt me. The result was not pretty, it was effective. I stole her position, and in doing so, I made sure that the next person who tried to take by charm would find the house bolted, the windows watched, and the doors guarded. The final moment came when I sat alone at my desk late one winter night and looked at the city through the glass, the same city that had seemed so cold the night I first left that meeting. A snow started to fall, and it dusted the streets with white and made the world look new. I pressed my palm to the cold glass and felt the tremor in my hand steady. The office hummed faintly with the machines that make work possible. I thought of Claire and of everything we had been to each other. I thought of my father and my mother, and the way they taught me to balance the books of life, even when the pages were stained. I thought of the ledger I keep in my drawer and of the sticky note she left. I thought of morality and of how much of it is simply another form of courage. I realized then that the price of being seen was not only the fight, but the knowledge that you had changed someone else forever. I had wanted to be seen, and in being seen, I had to take a life in small pieces. The thought did not ruin me. It made me recognize the shape of the person I had become. I closed my eyes and let the room fall away. When I opened them, I smiled for the first time in months. It was not a gentle smile. It was a smile that carried the taste of iron and the cold clarity of a knife that had been sharpened and used. It fit my face like armor. I had stolen her position, and I had made sure it could not be taken again. The city outside was indifferent and beautiful, and I felt the hard heat of victory settle into my bones. I had taken what was mine, and I had given back a lesson that would not be forgotten.